Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first customer-focused webinar. This is a new series we'll be starting, and its goal is to highlight key resources, trainings, and best practices when it comes to getting the most out of the Vectra platform. Today's webinar will be led by consulting analyst Martin Baker. Martin is an excellent resource, and today he'll be focusing on triaging best practices with Sidekick MDR. Let's cover some housekeeping items before we begin, and then we'll get started. The recording of this session will be shared with you after the webinar. If you have any questions during the session, you can type them into the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your console, and we'll address as many as time permits. We've also listed a handful of resources we think you'll find helpful, as well as a quick link to our self-service ransomware demo. With that, I'd like to bring in Martin to lead the session. Martin, please take it away.
Thank you, Saray. Okay. Just want to confirm, you can see my tab, can't you, Saray?
Yep, we're good to go.
Yeah, thank you. So hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Triage Best Practices with Sidekick MDR. So my name is Martin Baker, and I'm one of the Sidekick members at Vectra AI. So today, we're going to learn how to solve challenges around alert fatigues, streamline our triage process for effectiveness, and we'll learn how to write some good, effective triage rules. Now, throughout this demonstration today, I'm going to be using our demonstration platform, and the triage activity that I perform in our environment will be different to yours. And the triage activity performed in your environment should reflect conditions that will be for your services, your IP ranges, and your hosts. And these have to be applicable to your environment. So when we triage, this is what we call identifying normal and persistent on our network, and it's critical for good analysis. So specific hosts on a network are going to perform specific tasks. For example, a scanner is going to perform scanning tasks or activities, and a domain controller is going to be performing most likely highly privileged activities. So this is going to be inevitable on any network. But these are going to be ongoing authorized behaviors, and we can triage these out. And this will help us. Then this will remove undue noise and detection fatigue. And today, we're going to be looking at a host that has been flagged for further investigation in our environment. So the host that we're going to be investigating today is called Dave. So as we can see, the host Dave has previously had a number of detections of various categories and types. But today, we're going to be concentrating on the active detections only. So before looking at any specific detections on this host, we can start by looking at some information available to us regarding this host. So these will be including IP addresses, any groups, and any contextual information regarding this host by looking at any tags or notes that have been applied. So we can see that this host is a member of the end user's device Windows group. And we can also see that this host is a member of the end user device IP group. We have no notes and we have no tags visible to us. So the first detection that we're going to look at today for a triage opportunity will be the suspect domain activity detection. So looking into this detection, we can see that a successful DNS lookup has been performed against our internal DNS server. And this has been for the detection has triggered for a domain generation algorithm, or DJ for short, a domain. So we can see here this COVID random letters afterwards. So following an internal investigation actually into this activity, it's become apparent that this domain has actually been flagged by multiple security vendors as a risk. So we've gone off and we've spoken to the user, and they have stated that the activity that was performed that we can see here, that an NS lookup took place. So we asked why, and they've said that this was for research and security purposes. So logs have also been investigated, however, and this was looking for any browsing activity. And the user, as they said, an NS lookup took place, no browsing activity was observed. So we can now start to triage this detection to reduce the host score. So looking at our triage options here, we can see the triage. So we can create a new filter rule, we can filter just this detection, or we can mark as fixed. But before we decide which triage option we're going to use for this, we need to understand the differences and the best triage option for us. So the first triage option we're presented with is create a new filter rule. So creating a new filter rule is a way of how an analyst would express this overall behavior as being okay. So we would create this filter rule for behavior that is benign and no longer needed to be scored. This will apply to new detections of this type and matching conditions that we will select whilst creating this filter. This will remove the scoring from all future detections on this host and any other host that we select within our conditions. So in this example, we would not want to filter for this host or any other host on our network browsing to this domain. So our second option that we have is filter just this detection. So filter just this detection is when we would have a specific detection that is authorized, but the overall behavior is not. So we would select this option when a single instance of the behavior has been observed and determined to be benign and no longer needs to be scored. So in this example, this activity has not been authorized. So the third option we have is mark as fixed. So mark as fixed is when for an analyst has taken remedial action. So remedial action could be something like re-imaging a system, speaking to the user's manager, or a number of other actions. And once marked as fixed, this detection will no longer contribute to the host or account scoring. So in this case, remedial action did take place. The domain has been added to our blocking list due to the security threat that it poses. So for this detection, we will be marking as fixed. So once this detection has been marked as fixed, we can now go back to the host level. It will remove the score. Now we can see that the threat uncertainty of this host has changed. Now this is due to other positive indicators that have been observed. So it's worth noting that triaging a single detection will not always result in the threat uncertainty being reduced collectively. So we can see the suspect domain activity detection here. We now have a tick and the tooltip will state mark as fixed. Now it's worth noting that we are able to undo our actions that we have taken. So we can go back into the detection, we go triage fixed, and we can unmark this detection as fixed. We can now go back to the host, and we can see that the threat uncertainty score has returned. However, in this case, we will keep this detection marked as fixed. So the second detection that we're going to investigate for triage opportunity today is going to be our smash and grab detection. So looking at our smash and grab detection, we can see that we have some external domains listed and the data that has been sent. So within this detection, we can see that the domains are possibly related to speed tests, but this is purely based on the naming convention of the domain alone. However, additional information has been gathered about these domains, and we have concluded that these are indeed speed test domains. Now, it turns out that the user in this case has browsed to speedtest.net and they've performed a speed test. However, within our company or the company policy, it states that using these domains is prohibited and it's not authorized on the network due to the large amounts of bandwidth that these tests consume. And we can see that 1.9 gigabytes has been sent to these domains over a very short period of time. So whilst investigating this detection, it also became apparent that the user was highlighting to the IT department that they were having poor network connectivity. The IT support suggested to perform a speed test to check their network speeds. So we have concluded that this activity has been authorized as a one-off event, and this single instance of behavior in this case is benign. So again, looking at our triage filters, we have the following options. We can create a new filter rule, filter just this detection, and mark as fixed. Now, we have already discussed that this activity is not permitted on our domain, but this has been authorized for this one-time action. Because of this, the single filter just this detection is the one we will select. So we are then presented with a list of options to select. So we are able to recategorize this detection, and once renamed, this detection will no longer contribute to the host score. So we can see some previously applied labels, or we can create our own. But in this example, we can see that there has been a previous detection for speed test domains. Now we're going to select this option as it best fits the activity that we've observed. However, we can add some further context on here. So we're going to add network checks authorized by IT. We select save the changes. At this point, we are able to add a tag or a note to add some more contextual information. Now it's worth noting, when we go back to the host, we can see that this has been filtered by user. And we can also see that the detection type has changed name to speed test domains, network checks authorized. And again, we can see the icon just here where it has now been filtered by the user. And it's worth noting at this point again, we are able to go into this detection and we are able to undo the actions that we've committed. As before, this will change the host threat uncertainty score for this host. So moving on to our third detection today. So we have an internal darknet scan, and this will trigger when an internal host has contacted a number of internal IP addresses that have not been active in the recent past. So looking into this detection, we can see that a total of 44 IP addresses were contacted over port 443. And we can also see that the destination IP groups was web server testing domain. So depending on the user operating on the host, Dave, this could indicate activity is expected to be performed. So investigation into this activity has indicated that the user of this host has been added or moved into a web development team recently. So seeing that a host is performing scans over 443 to IP addresses that are in the web server testing domain isn't really unusual or suspicious. So we have been advised also that we should add this host to the web dev host group. So we're now going to go back to the host and we can now add this host to the web dev group. So we can now go back into the detection. So we have now concluded that this activity is authorized and it's expected to be performed. So we can now look at our triage options. Now, looking at our triage, we now have a 1 that's in our next to the triage. So expanding our triage options, we can see that there is a suggestion. And suggestions are based on rules that are already implemented on the system. And if a detection matches similar to a rules condition, it will show up as a suggestion. And in this case, we can see that there are 2 matching conditions. So we have port 443, and we can also see an IP address that's in the web server testing domain. And we can also see that IP address here. So we can see the 2 matching conditions. So an analyst can further edit this rule if they want to make broader changes, or simply click the suggestion to apply this host to this triage filter. In this case, we are going to want to edit this rule. So in this case, we can see that we have a single user in this domain. So from here, we can add any host is of. So we can put in here the web dev group. So we can also put IP as any of, and we can apply the web dev testing. So we can remove this single IP address. The web dev testing domain. We can now put some more contextual information in here. So we are able to add some additional comments in here saying that we've amended this triage this filter, or we can leave it as it is. In this case, we will leave how it is. We can now click save. We will now have a warning. It will now tell us how many detections are going to be changed following the previous changes that we've made to this filter. In this case, we can see one detection is going to be triaged from the internal darknet scan, and it's now going to be triaged as a HTTPS web scan. We can now save, and we can now see that this detection has now been filtered by a rule. We can now go to our host, and we can now see that this detection has now been triaged. So the final detection that we have here is a port sweep activity. So looking at this port sweep activity, we can see that the host Dave has been performing sweeps on port 21, port 22, and port 443 on their respective services. Now, the port sweep activity observed to port 443 seems very similar to the previous detection that we've triaged. Although the host Dave, the port, and the target IP range match our previous filter, this is a different model that has triggered. And it's worth noting at this point that a single triage filter cannot be made to cover every detection type and category. These will be needed to be made individually for each model. Now again, looking at the information we have presented, we now need to confirm if the activity we are observing has been authorized. So again, speaking to the user or their manager, they have been instructed to look for open ports on these ranges. So the user has indicated that this activity will also be ongoing and it's going to be performed periodically. So for this detection, we are going to create new filter rule. So we have to apply a label. So in this case, we're going to apply the label open port sweep activity. So we're then going to add a description. So it's worth noting at this point that adding a meaningful description is going to help other analysts why this has happened, and more importantly, why this triage filter has been created. Now, I've seen in the past where customers have used JIRA ticket numbers or other service desk reference numbers in here, and this actually helps analysts to get further information as to why this filter has been created. So we can put things in our service desk such as who created it, when it was created, and why it was created. So we are now going to put a description in here. So for us, Vectra Sidekick, we will put VSK, we will put the date of when this filter was made. The initial of the analyst, and we're going to put a brief description of what this is. So we're going to put open port sweep activity authorized. So we're now going to look at our source conditions. So our source conditions can be this single host Dave. We found out that Dave will be the only person that will be permitted to perform in this action. So we now need to look at our additional conditions. So in this case, we have a condition is port is any of. So we're now going to apply some ports. Now it's worth noting at this point that when we select the field, we're presented with an autocomplete. Now an autocomplete will pull any of the metrics from the detection that we've observed and apply them as an option to complete into our filter. So it's worth noting that when we create any filters within a detection, any relevance will be displayed in front of us on here. So we're going to apply these ports 443, 21, and 22. So we will now click save. And we can now see that one triage one detection is going to be triaged, previous name, port sweep, as we can see, and after change, this will be the open port sweep activity, and it's now been triaged. So we can now click save. We have now triaged all of our detections on this host. And we can see that we have a 0 threat and 0 certainty. So far, we have now covered how to triage from host detections. So we're now going to make some triage filters for behavior likely to trigger detections on our network for Teams activity. So we're going to head over to the Manage section and the Triage Filters. So to create a new filter, we need to click the Create Filter button. From here, we are presented with a different type of filter that we want to create. So we are now going to select New. We are presented with the different categories. And the data smuggler detection are exfiltration events. So we're going to select exfiltration. We now see the different detection types in this category. So the data smuggler is the one we will select. Now we are now ready to make our filter rule. So as we've previously said, we're going to apply a label to this. And in this case, we're going to put Teams activity. We're now going to put a meaningful description. And we can even put some more context in here about why we've made this. So we're now going to look at our source conditions. So we have our options. We can either have host as any of, or we can have IP as any of. Now, looking at our options for host as any of, we have several options. We have end user devices on our area. So we have end user devices, all OS, Mac, Windows, and Linux. However, we also have an IP group that's available to us. Now, an IP group would be the preferred option in this case. IP groups will be able to contain all of the hosts within a certain range, whether it's a client network or whether it's an office network. So we will look for the end user devices IP group, as we can see. So we're then going to move on to our additional conditions. So in our additional conditions, we actually have external destination is any of. So we're going to select this. So it's worth noting at this point, we have options within the platform. We have IP groups that Cognito manages and maintains for us. So we're going to select Cognito Office 365. This contains the IP addresses that are used by the Office 365 service. So we are now going to add some logic to this filter, and we're going to be applying an AND filter. So we will now select the external ports is any of. So Teams uses ports 3478 to 3481. So we're going to add this range to our filter. And it's worth noting at this point, we can put ranges using the dash instead of having to enter 3478, 3479, etc. We now press enter, and we now have our ports entered. Now this completes our triage filter. At this point, we have no detections that match this filter rule. So now we can create. So now we're in this triage filters page. We're going to look at have a look at some of our existing filters that we've previously made. Now, Vectra recommend reviewing triage filters on a regular basis, and this will highlight any issues that you may have. So looking at our triage filters in place, I'm going to highlight some that we should review. So I'm going to start with looking at some rules that contain all hosts. So triage rules that have all hosts are rules that the source setting of all hosts. So sometimes this may appear appropriate, however, it's best practice to try and limit the scope for your rules. For example, avoiding hosts that are servers, such as domain controllers, for end user device activity or vice versa. So an example for this would be we wouldn't expect to see a domain controller accessing online streaming content, Spotify or Netflix, or even an end user device performing replication services. So an example of this can be seen in the suspicious HTTP traffic triage rule. So in this rule, we can see that we have no source conditions and we have no additional conditions. And this means that all hosts on our network that will have detections trigger for suspicious HTTP will automatically be triaged. And in this example, it will be for all hosts going to any domain or IP address where this is triggered. So we can tighten this filter by performing some basic actions. We can add a source and we can add some additional conditions to limit the scope. So we're going to start by adding our source conditions. So we said earlier about the option of having our host is any of, or our IP is any of. And we said that the IP is any of would be the preferred one in this case. So we're going to look for end user devices. And we're going to select the end user devices IP group. So we're now going to look at our additional conditions. So we can apply individual domains or as a group. So we currently do have a domain group for authorized HTTP domains. So we're going to apply this group. Now, domains can be added to this group whenever necessary, and applying the domain to the group and the group being applied to this filter will automatically triage future detections when they've been added. So we can now save. And depending on the detection, if any have been caught by this filter, we will be able to see any detections that have been marked. In this case, we do not have any, so we can save the changes. So the next filters that we're going to be reviewing are risky rules. So risky rules are defined as rules that are likely too broad, and as such, those including destination IP siders greater than /16. So with no port conditions, all the destination domains are covering a full shared service such as Amazon AWS.com. Now, looking into the detection we can see we have the authorized connections. Authorized connections to AWS. So, looking at this triage filter, we can see that we have a single host going to an external target domain is any of, and we can see here that we've got wildcard Amazon AWS.com. Now we want to put a better domain actually into this detection. So we've gone off, we've asked the user for more information about their AWS bucket and what it's called. So they provided us the information. So now we can update the filter. So the information that has been provided, we can now copy and we can now paste this into our filter. And in this case, this is the bucket name we've been given. So we press enter, and now we have that. So we are now able to provide some more logic into this because the user of this host informed us that all activity will be performed over port 443. So we can add an external port. And in this case, 443. We press enter, and now we can apply and save these changes. Again, no previous detections have been filtered from the activity that's been observed. So we can now save these changes. So we're now going to review our stagnant filter. So stagnant filters are ones that have not fired on a detection for a period of time. And as I said previously, we recommend reviewing all triage filters regularly. In this instance, we are reviewing detections that have not triggered for 3 months or more. In this example, we can see that this rule has not triggered since September the 6th, 2021. Now we can review this rule by looking at the conditions. And in this case, we can see that it's the executive machines group. But looking at the additional conditions, we can see that any domain in the HTTPS tunnels abnormal beacon. And we can also see as well that we've got a tunnel type is any of abnormal beacon. So following a review, we've decided that we are going to delete this triage filter. Now, to delete a triage filter, we need to select the bin icon. Now, we're then presented with an information here saying that one detection has been labeled by this filter, abnormal beacon. We now need to decide what we are going to do with this single detection. We can keep this detection marked as the previous name, abnormal beacon, or we can restore this detection to its original type and rerun the triage filters. Now, in this case, we're going to keep the detection marked as hidden tunnel HTTPS. However, restoring the detections and rerunning the triage filters won't really make a difference on this detection because the last time it triggered was 6 months ago. So this detection would now be out of date. It would now be inactive. So we can now select delete this filter. This filter has now been deleted and removed from our list. So we're now going to look at some generic triage filters. So generic triage filters are ones that are using generic host containers. And these are assigned when Detect cannot identify a host and it's given in the name form of IP-IP address. Now this is where hostname artifacts would be very poor or are there none available. So lack of reverse DNS, Kerberos, DHCP, etc. So ideally, hosts with this name should not be used as source conditions, and we should attempt to use host names or IP addresses or IP groups. So in this example, we're going to use the command and control hidden HTTPS, and we're going to look for hidden tunnel from traffic host. So this triage filter has not triaged a detection from this host since the filter was created. So using our description within the filter, we can see that the filter was created on December the 25th. And using our host page, we have performed a search and we can see that the last time this host was observed on our network was December the 28th. So we've decided in this case that we're going to delete this triage filter. Now we are displayed with a different notification that we previously saw. We have 0 detections labeled by this filter, hidden tunnel traffic from host, because we have no previous detections. So in this case, again, we can delete the filter. So now we're going to move to some underscope filters. And underscope filters are ones that are too narrowly defined. And these can lead to creating multiple filters that need to be managed as opposed to one filter looking for the same condition. And in this example, we're going to look for some exfil hidden DNS tunnels. So looking at these triage filters, expand. So looking at these triage filters, we can see that they all have the same source conditions, well, ish. We can see on here that we have host is any of, and we have host group. On here, we have host group, but on here, we have end user devices IP group. As we said earlier, this is the preferred option that we will have. So what we will now do is we will take the additional conditions of these domains, and we are now going to put them into this single triage filter up here. So we can copy these, and we can edit this triage filter, and we can add these domains. So while we're here, we should change the label because this is no longer a single AV update. So we can now put on here AV updates multiple vendors. We should now change the description because we've changed this triage filter significantly. So on here, we can change the details for today's date, the analyst that performed it, and a brief description of what this is. We can now save changes, and we can save changes again. So following on from modifying these triage filters, we are now able to delete these two after consolidation. So we can delete this, and again, 0 detections, and we can delete the filter. And again, we can delete this triage filter as well. So we have now reduced 3 triage filters down to 1 because they all contain now the same conditions. So the final filters that we are going to review are whitelist filters. And now this is very important because it's a common misnomer that rules created within the system is known as whitelisting. Now this is incorrect, and the term whitelist in the Cognito platform specifically means to remove from the UI. Now, custom filters are going to recategorize detections and rename them, but it's going to leave these in the UI. However, both options, whitelist and custom filters, will mean that the detection will no longer contribute to an account or host score. And while sometimes whitelists may seem appropriate, custom triage rules are the best way, and they're able for you to see the behavior if it's related to an attack. So we recommend that whitelists should constitute less than 10% of your entire rule set. So as we can see, in our network, in our platform here, we have 4 whitelist filters. We have 16 filters in total. So we really should be reviewing these whitelist filters at the earliest opportunity. So now that we've covered the triage filter review and we're on the topic of whitelist filters, we're going to look at the detections for internal darknet scan and an automated replication. And these detections are often observed for activity associated with Windows Delivery Optimization, or Voodoo for short. So Voodoo is a service that's designed by Microsoft, and it delivers updates from hosts that have already been updated, and it's reduction of bandwidth on your network. So although most enterprises choose to update these via dedicated servers such as SCCM, etc., this method of update is still common. So this may be an opportunity to make use of a whitelist filter. So before we make any filters of any whitelist type, we need to make sure that we gather as many conditions as we can. So firstly, we should be looking at IP groups, and Voodoo should only be applicable to Windows networks. So what we're going to do now, we're going to make a whitelist filter. So we're going to create filter, and we're going to look at a whitelist. So we're now given all the different options. So as we said earlier, Voodoo detections, they're internal darknet. So internal darknet, we're going to look at a reconnaissance, and we're going to choose the internal darknet scan. So we can now select our source conditions, but before we do, we have a warning here that matching behavior will be hidden entirely from view. And again, the warning that I've said already, we should only do this if we are confident that the behavior is benign. So the internal darknet scan is the original detection, but we see we no longer have a label. Well, we won't need a label because this will no longer be in the UI and we will not see it. So we're going to put a description in here. And again, we need to put a meaningful description. So in this case, we're going to put VSK . Voodoo activity. So we said earlier that we need to get as many conditions as we can. So we're going to look to see whether we've got any IP groups for Windows. And we do. So we have end user devices for Windows. So we're able to enter this as our source condition. Now for our additional condition, we have IP is any of and port is any of. So again, we should limit this to Windows networks. So again, end user devices, Windows. We can also add some additional logic to this as well. And we can now put an AND. So Voodoo runs on port 7680. And we now hit enter. And we now create this filter rule. So no previous detections have been observed within the system that will create a change. So we can click create. So in this case, we now have 5 whitelist filters, which we will need to be reviewing. So at this point, I'm going to introduce a page to you that some of you may have not previously seen. So Triage Advisor. So Triage Advisor recommends a scope for triage filters. Now, for each detection cluster we see, we should investigate one or more of these detections to decide how we want to treat the identified behavior that has been recommended for us. So once we've investigated the behavior that's observed, by clicking here on the magnifying glass, we're able to actually go and see the detections that it's included in our filter. So once we've investigated this behavior that we can see, we can either mark those detections as fixed when we've taken action, like blocking domains or firewalls, etc. Or we can use the recommendation within this triage filter to classify this as authorized behavior. Now, in this case, we can see that a number of these devices are Windows computers. So further investigation would be required to see whether any other of these devices are not Windows, for example, here. Now, would this rule or this filter that we're going to create, would this benefit from being an IP group or a host group? We then need to see what this target server is. Now, in this case, we can see that the target server is a 10.54. Now, it's worth noting at this point that these would normally be classed as internal IP ranges. However, looking at our settings, we can see that these have actually been excluded within our IP ranges. So these are actually external IP addresses. So it would be a good idea in these instances to maybe put these IP addresses into groups. So we're now going to look at some different ways of triaging. So we're now going to look at some detections. So looking at the dashboard view, we can see that we have a large number of recon detections. So selecting the recon from here, we're now displayed all of our reconnaissance detections and the various types that we can see. So we're going to pick the RDP recon. So looking at these detections, what we're going to try and observe is any commonalities between any of these detections, the sources, the targets, and is there anything what we could potentially triage on? So in this case, when we expand, we can see that we have a number of hosts going to repetitive server or repetitive targets. And in this case, we have a jump server and we have a jump server backup. So we can also see that we've got an RDP client tokens remote access and the RDP client names encrypted RDP client name. So in this case, we've done our investigations and we would like to triage these detections. So we can go in, and as we've previously shown before, we've now determined that this activity is authorized and expected. So we can now triage these detections. So for this, we will create a new filter rule, and we will label this as expected RDP activities. Once again, we will give it a meaningful description. And we're now going to pick some hosts. So we've observed that this is happening on the end user devices network. So again, we're going to pick the IP group. Now, again, the IP group will more likely have better host name for us to actually group with, or host grouping for us. So end user device IP group. So now looking at our additional conditions, we've got several options here. So we can pick internal target domain is any of. We can pick the target IP as any of. We can also pick the client name and the token name. So in this case, we're going to pick the internal target IP is any of. And we saw two that were listed. So the backup jump server and the jump server. So we're going to select both of these IP addresses. We're also going to apply some additional logic. And in this case, we're going to put the RDP client name is any of, and using our autocomplete, we're going to select. And also we're going to add up some more logic, and we're going to apply the RDP client token is any of. Now in this case, we have remote access and remote that was seen in all of the detections. So we're now going to click save. Now we have a large number of detections here that are going to be triaged. Now previously we only saw one. Now in this case we're seeing 17. Now if we're only expecting to see a low number at this point, we should go back and we should review all of our source conditions and all of our additional conditions that have been applied. Now in this case, as we observed previously, we were aware that there were going to be a number of detections that would be triaged. So from here, we're going to save because this is the expected number that we're going to be seeing. And now we can save this triage filter. Now this rule has been created. So before I hand it over to the floor for any questions that anybody may have, I just want to give some takeaway points for people to consider when they're actually creating triage filters. So we need to ask ourselves a couple of things. So what is actually causing the activity that's triggering these detections? You know, what is the scope? What are we looking at? Is this a single source going to many destinations or targets? Or are we looking at many sources going to multiple destinations? And as we saw just now, are there any commonalities similar to what we have observed in the last triage filter? So the next point is, once we are confident that we've made good triage filters and we followed our best practices that we've reviewed just now, we should really look at enhancing these filters by continuously adding hosts to groups and IP addresses to groups and also domains to groups. And we should review these triage filters on a regular basis, improving our groups. And finally, whitelists. And again, we said that while sometimes whitelists are appropriate, custom triage rules are the best way to go forward. They will allow you to see the behaviors related to an attack. And as we've discussed previously, the detections that happen or trigger when a whitelist, it's removed from the UI. So with that, if I'll put out any questions that anybody may have for me.
Wonderful. Thanks, Martin. Actually, as you were chatting in the past hour, we did have a handful of questions come through. So I'll go through and ask you those. And for those listening, thank you. We have a handful of customers who joined us today for the past hour. We'd love to answer your questions as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Martin, the first one just popped in. Where can I find that Triage Advisor page? Do you mind showing us quickly?
Okay. So on my browser tab, so on your serial or your URL, When you go to just your dashboard, so nothing after, type / triage and then -advisor. Are you able to put that in the chat? Are you, Sri?
I will, if
Yeah, there we
you
go. I'll
don't
just put
mind.
it into our chat. There we go.
Perfect. And I will respond with this info to those that asked. A few people had asked that question, so I will respond individually to
Cheers.
each of
Thank you.
you. Okay, a couple other questions pop through as I'm doing that, so maybe you can answer while I answer those other ones regarding where to locate the triage page. This one is, when I triage detections, I no longer see them under the detection view. Is it possible to still see them there?
So yes. So if we head over to detections on here. So here we can see all of our active detections that we've got here. These are the detections that need to be looked at or addressed within our network. And we can see here that we've got 177 that need to be addressed. However, in this status box that we have just here, we have a drop down and we can actually view filtered by user only, or we can look at the filtered, the triaged detections, the marked as fixed, or we can look at ones that are inactive. And as we see the icon, the inactive, or alternatively, we can select all of them. And now we can see all 9,526 detections that have been observed on our platform. So hopefully that answered the question for you.
Awesome. Yes, thank you, Martin. Our next one is, this is a customer who has Sidekick. So I have Sidekick MDR and noticed a number of detections labeled as AI filtered. Can you explain a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah. Okay. So the AI triage, it's a feature that the Sidekick team, security research, and the data science that we've worked on, or collaboratively worked on together. So it's going to look for some of these commonalities that we spoke about previously, and it's going to automatically triage the detections for us. So it's going to be available to all customers in future releases, but Sidekick customers are able to benefit this now as part of an early release. Okay. So if hopefully that'll again answer the question for you. But if you require any more information, then yeah, just let us know.
Perfect. Thank you. We have just a couple more and then we can wrap up. If any customers still joined with us right now have questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A so we can go in and answer those for you. Martin, the next question, is there a way to segregate based on region and triage specifically for these users?
Okay, so if we have, so what we'll do is we'll pick a detection for an example here. Again, we'll just look for any detection. So when we're going to triage on here, again, if we're going to triage in locality, so we're going to then create a new triage filter. So on our source conditions, we actually have the option of sensor is any of. Now, depending on geographical regions or locations, we're likely going to have sensors put in, Australia, America, UK, France, etc. So for these, if we wanted to triage out automatically, for example, a certain region would use certain software, we're able to select this sensor, and we're then able to put the end user devices group. However, what we're also able to do is we're able to create multiple groups, and some of the points I said to take away were about creating additional groups based on IPs. So we're able to create different ones or groups based on different clients for different locations in the world. So we have two options here to create for geographical locations, and that is the sensor, and we can also have the IP as any of, and we can use our groups that we can create in the future.
Excellent. Thanks, Martin. We had another question come through. So for those who have joined us today, the webinar has been recorded and we will share the recording of this after the webinar. So you can refer to it later down the road If you missed the link, you can click on the same landing page link to access the recording as well. So there's a few ways to access the demo that Martin has given us today. Okay, we have 2 more questions, Martin. The next one is, if I have a bunch of detections in the low and medium quadrants, should I triage those, or since they aren't in high critical? Should I triage those since they are not in high/critical?
So looking at hosts that are not in high and critical, so we'll look at these ones, for example. So we need to take care, when we're actually looking at the ones in the low and the medium detections. Now, it's a good idea to address, the detections that are actually in here, because it will unnecessarily undo a host being pushed from the low to the medium to the high or even to the critical, and it's going to push them up incorrectly. So, doing what we did just now and using some of the practices that we saw, actually looking at the detections and commonalities, we'll be able to triage these out. But yeah, actually triaging the ones in these, quadrants, we're going to safeguard against these hosts being pushed up unnecessarily into these quadrants.
Thank you, Martin. Our next question. Does the mark as critical asset functionality change anything, such as scoring, or is it only a visual identifier?
So the mark as critical, this is for a visual identifier, and it's worth noting at this point that we've got 2 options on here. So we can see on here that's targeting, and we can then see is a key asset on here. Okay, so it is just for visual, so we can actually see what's being targeted on here. Okay.
Great, thank you. This next one is a quick one. Just out of curiosity, what does the abbreviation VSK mean that you use in the triage filter descriptions?
Yep. So that for us is Vectra Sidekick. So when we engage on Sidekick with our customers, we give our customers a TLA, or 3-letter acronym. So AAA. So when we communicate with our customers, we're able to put, for example, using one of our tags here, we can put VSK, investigate, for example, followed by some, the date and time. So then a customer could then come back to us with a tag and then put, for example, AAA, all good, or something along those lines. So VSK is just a method of us identifying ourselves to our customers and vice versa.
Thank you, Martin. So we have another question. We're wrapping up. I want to be respectful of time. We have a few minutes left. So this is regarding just recent news. Anything you're seeing from Russian actors due to the war there? And if yes, are there any triage rules that we can use? And I know that we had that customer email and blog that was created yesterday. If you could touch just a little briefly on that. And to the person who asked the question, we can follow up with you directly as well with some more information.
Yeah. So, well, currently, because of what's actually happened, not necessarily it's too easy to see, but yeah, if Sri will follow up on that. So thank you, Sri. Yeah.
Great. And this next one, I believe it was in regards to a question we had asked earlier, which was marking as a critical asset functionality like scoring if it's only a visual identifier. But this next question is, what is the tag and tagging used for in general?
Okay, so the tagging, this will be used for, in fact, this is a perfect example what I did just now. So we're going to apply a tag on here. So these will be like tactical notes that we can just pass over, just comments to each other. Whereas the notes function that we have here, these will be more comprehensive, and we can, actually looking at the note functionality, it supports Markdown. So in here, we can put things like links to Jira tickets or external, hyperlinks. Because it supports Markdown, it supports a range of options in here. But the tags that we apply here, like I said, these will be used for, just to hand over quick snippet bits of information, to whether it be to customer to Sidekick, or whether it be customer teams to customer teams. And again, we can search on these tags as well by actually going into the host, for example, and we can then put the advanced function, and we can then just put tags, the autocomplete comes up for us, and then we can just type in here VSK. It's a wildcard search, so it's going to find any tags for us with the with VSK that's on there. And as we can see, VSK investigate.
Wonderful. Thank you, Martin. We're at the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you for taking the time to walk through the best practices around triage, and with everything out of the way regarding questions. Thank you to our audience. We had so many of you join us today as customers, and thank you so much for your questions and for your attentiveness. If you have any other questions regarding Sidekick, any other triage best practices, don't hesitate to reach out to your customer success manager. Thank you everyone for joining. As a reminder, the recording of this webinar will be shared with you shortly. And this is a monthly series, so keep an eye out for the next one. All right, thank you everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.